Hey everyone, welcome back to the virtual challenge. You've been writing for about 2.5 weeks now, so this is week 3. And we're going to talk about tension and conflict this week. And it's a way of keeping your readers on their toes, keeping them invested in your characters, and making it feel real. Okay. I'm going to jump right in with our writer's block suggestion here. So if you are feeling writer's block at this point, consider some of the other suggestions that I gave, but another one is to look at what is causing your block. So take a look at the last couple scenes that you've written. Does something seem off? Are you not excited about where the story has ended up recently? If there is an element that's not working the way you hoped it was, identify that part of your scene and then write a new scene where that element has been changed. When I say write a new scene, I don't mean get rid of the old one, keep that one, but write a new one that kind of stems from wherever it was that you identified that issue you didn't like. You didn't like how it was changing the story, so you wanted to go somewhere different. Okay, and that can hopefully create a new branch of the story for you. But you may want to make a note there in your writing, just so you know what you did in terms of taking a second branch of the story. And then when you come back after you've finished writing, or when you've at least stopped at the end of the month, you can decide which scene you like better, or maybe you might ultimately decide that you like bits and pieces of both scenes, and so you write it again into a third. And that's totally okay. That's part of the revising process. All right. So moving on into what we're actually going to talk about this week, we'll be talking about tension and conflict. And so I've got this definition of tension for you from botanica.com. It says tension is a balance maintained in artistic work between opposing forces or elements, or a controlled, dramatic, or dynamic quality. I'm also going to give you a definition of conflict a little bit later on, but this definition of tension is kind of important because it gets at a balance. And opposing forces or opposing elements, which may be slightly different, but you want to think about when you're trying to raise those stakes or create more tension, what happens if that balance that we're talking about shifts one way or the other. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to this tool, which I think is super helpful when you're thinking about any scene, whether you're thinking about a book that you like and you're analyzing it for tension, or if you are talking about writing a new scene and you're not sure exactly how to go about building tension. This is a great thing to come back to. And what I call it the 4 C's. You have to think change plus choice plus conflict equals consequences. And that is how you build tension. That is the long and short of it. I'm going to give you some tips, and I'm going to go into a few different things today. But if you take nothing else away, this is what you want to remember. Okay? And so I'll define those a little bit for you. You're thinking change is any kind of twist in the story, any element that takes them out of what was happening and forces them to respond. Choices. Anytime your character has to make a choice between one thing or another, one person or another, one idea, one belief, anything like that, when they have to make a choice of any kind, there will be consequences. They may be small. They may be, a micro conflict or a micro story inside your bigger novel, but it will affect something. Okay. And then you can think of direct conflict. So that can be a relationship between two characters where they totally don't agree, or they think they agree, but it turns out that their reasons are very different. And so they ultimately have two different ideas of how they should go about resolving the issue or getting what they want. Okay. And then the consequences are the important part. So when we talked about characters, we mentioned that we want our characters to have agency. And so we give them those choices. We give them desires and fears that bring them into conflict or force them to change in some way. And so there are always consequences for who they are, what they want, what they feel. And that really drives your story. And this is kind of cyclical in the sense that those consequences that come out of those choices or the conflicts that they have ultimately lead to more change, choice, and conflict. Okay. All right, so just a little more explanation on that. These elements that I talked about in that formula, they make something happen in your story. So they keep it from being stagnant. They keep moving it forward. So you don't want to get stuck and bogged down in one portion of the story. If you've ever had a book that you've read and you've just kind of been like, wow, this just feels like it's dragging on forever, you don't want your reader to feel that. So you want to keep moving forward in the journey, in the growth of the character. Like I said, it keeps from being stagnant and boring, so it creates a sense of urgency, like that something has to happen or something is going to happen. That anticipation that your reader feels comes from the creation of tension and conflict. And it also helps to create kind of an ebb and flow in the story that leads to the climax. All right, so here is that definition that I mentioned of conflict. And this actually comes from the NaNoWriMo workbooks, but they describe literary conflict as the clashing of one's desires with their own faults, the desires of others, and the circumstances surrounding them. And that clash is kind of the important part. So they're going to butt heads with someone. They may butt heads with themselves and a belief that they want to hold on to, but realize that it doesn't really fit what they think about the world anymore, things like that. All right, so I'm going to show you this little breakdown on internal versus external conflict. And if you want to read more, this image that I've pulled out here is actually from the workbook. And those pages are page 15 to 18, talks about internal versus external conflict. And so just to give you a visualization of that, you can look at this little illustration here. So external conflict is anything that happens between a protagonist and an antagonist, or anything on the outside. So you're talking about your protagonist versus a corrupt politician, or your protagonist who has a conflict with a perceived weakness in one of their allies, or your protagonist against a secret organization, coming into conflict with, a friend's competing interest that gets in the way of their own interest. When you have those structural systems of oppression like racism, any kind of nature, so a blizzard or a tornado, those are external conflicts that your character is going to come up against. And you'll probably have a lot of those. A lot of times you will see stories where the main antagonist is an external source. But you may also be doing an exploration of your character, and so you may have a little bit more internal conflict. And a lot of scenes, I will show you this in a second, a lot of scenes have a little bit of both. And that's normal, and that's good. You want to include both. But depending on what your story is about, and whether it focuses more on the plot or the character development, might decide whether you have more internal versus external conflict. But your internal conflicts include any kind of fears, insecurities that your character has to overcome to get what they want, or to solve the problem, or to get to the end of the journey. So that could be character flaws. It could be assumptions that they make about themselves or other people, or the world around them that they have to overcome. It could be insecurities about themselves, doubt about their abilities, fear of something that they have to face, or that they're not good enough, a lot of different feelings. And it also includes mental illness. So if your character is dealing with depression or any kind of mental blockage that is getting in the way of them being able to perform the task they need to perform, or to get the role they want to get, those are kind of internal conflicts to think about. I've got an excerpt here from a book that I really love, The Forest of Hands and Teeth. It's about zombies, and I really love zombies, so I like to talk about books that deal with them, which you may have noticed last week when I mentioned Dread Nation. I'm going to go ahead and read the scene for you. And on the side, I've kind of pointed out the elements from the 4C formula that you want to think about here. Harry grins and he drops his head toward me, and all I can think about is how I never wanted Harry to be my first kiss. And then, before his lips can land on mine, we hear it. The siren. It's so old and so rarely used these days that it starts out with a creak and a wheeze, and then it is full blown. Harry's eyes meet mine, his face now a breath away. Is there supposed to be a drill today? I ask. He shakes his head. His eyes are as wide as mine must be. His father's the head of the Guardians, and he would know of any drills. I stand, ready to start sprinting back toward the village. Every inch of my skin tingles, my heart curling into a painful fist. All I can think is mother. Harry grabs my arm and pulls me back. We should stay here, he says. It's safer. What if the fences are breached? We need to find a platform. I can see the terror closing in on the irises of his eyes. His fingers dig into my wrist, almost clawing at me. But I keep pulling away, pushing at his hands and body until I am free. All right, so this is a great moment of tension in the story. And some of the ways that happens through conflict, change, and choice. Obviously, there's a conflict between what both characters want, once they hear the siren. He wants to stay. He wants to get to safety. She wants to go back because she's worried about her mother. And so they scuffle. They have an actual physical confrontation so that they can go after, their own desires in that moment, their competing desires. The change in that scene is definitely the siren going off. So at first there's this kind of quasi, unsatisfying romantic moment. And then that siren goes off and everything changes. They're not thinking about the fact that they almost kissed anymore. That doesn't matter. Now they're thinking danger, and so they have to respond to that, and they make choices. She makes the choice to leave him behind. That he can go for safety if he wants to, but she has something else she has to look for. She has something else she has to deal with, and that's the choice she makes. And so I don't list any consequences here. If you've read the story, you may know. If you haven't, you can probably make some educated guesses about some of the consequences of this scene and the choices that are made, the conflicts that take place. But that's what you want to think about when you're looking at a book that you like for inspiration, or if you're thinking about your own story and trying to add those elements in. Okay. So you may be wondering, where should I add conflict? And the short answer is pretty much almost anywhere. There's going to be a lot of different points of conflict and tension in your story, as you can see from this image that I showed at the end of last week. You've got these different plot points, and the tension is going up each time. So at least some of these are points of conflict, are choices being made. Okay. What you want to think about is what kind of conflict should go where. And so this kind of mentions some conflicts are going to be minor. They're going to be little things that are momentary bits of tension or aggravation, maybe in a scene. They only last for one or two scenes. And others are going to be major. They're going to affect the entire story throughout the whole thing. And so you want to think about how you spread them throughout your story in a way that makes sense. So a small inconvenience might not really matter after a much bigger conflict. If you've just, escaped with your life, from somewhere dangerous, some small argument you have might feel stupid and inconsequential. You're like, this doesn't matter. We almost died. But it can also hit a different way depending on what that conflict is. So maybe your character is just overburdened. They're dealing with so much. There's so much tension on their shoulders. And then that tiny little inconvenience that before would have been nothing is the thing that blows everything apart. They lose it. They start yelling at everyone. It depends on how you work it in. And there are a lot of ways to do it. It can make it really interesting. You also want to consider that they typically build over time, but it's not constant. So after you have an exciting incident, your first plot point, you notice that tension falls off briefly here. But over time, we end up all the way up here, even though there are drops in tension along the way. Okay. So you want to keep that in mind, that in most cases, most people can't handle constant pressure, tension, everything coming at them nonstop, 100% for the whole story. You want to give them moments to sit back and think about what has just happened to them, to make some choices, decide, okay, that happened, now I need to respond like this. You want some of those moments to kind of not just give your characters just a minor breather, but also to give your readers a second to process what has just happened as well. And then another consideration to make is that after your climax hits, your big battle, your big whatever, the tension falls off. Obviously, you see this very big difference over here in the resolution. It falls off a lot, but it doesn't get back down to where it was at the start. So your inciting incident, we were very low tension. But after our climax and we have all our falling action and resolution, we're still not back there. So it doesn't actually hit 0 because your character is still dealing with things. So in most cases, because they entered into this journey, that they've experienced so many new things, they've changed as a person, and they might not be able to go back to the way things were before all of this started. They have to find a new normal. They have to find a new way to exist in this world that works for them. You also might consider that the events aren't totally settled. Yeah, you had that big confrontation, and for the time being, perhaps you've survived. You're doing relatively okay. But there may be more to the story. And so that's when, you have the moment where, like, I smell a sequel. You need a whole other story to talk about all the fallout, right? That might happen. So there's more things that they're considering and dealing with at the end. Not all the loose ends are tied up. You also have to consider that maybe your character got the happy ending they wanted, but maybe they didn't. So if you have that character who didn't get exactly what they wanted, they now have to deal with how that affects their life. There's also the idea that maybe they got exactly what they wanted, and it turns out that exactly what they wanted was not what they needed, or what they thought they wanted wasn't what they actually wanted. So there's still internal conflicts happening and still tension going on at the end of the story. One way to think about your story and the movement and the amount of tension and stuff is this idea of the story in 3 acts. So according to some writers, the doorway from one act into the next is kind of like crossing a point of no return. So it happens first when your character decides they must enter into the journey, that it has to be them, it can't be someone else, they have to do this. And then again, when they've committed to see the action through to its conclusion, no matter what happens. They've decided, I have to do something or this will get worse. I have to do something or the world will end. If I don't do this, whether I die, whether I live, whether, bad things happen, I have to do this. And so that's the kind of the door into the last part of the story. And this little infographic here kind of gives you an idea of what's happening in each act. So what I've done is kind of broken down a few books that you may have read into their 3 acts. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You can look at that and see, compare the stories that you recognize, or maybe think about that with a book of your own that you really enjoy. But if you look at Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the moment that his adventure truly begins is when he is told that he's a wizard. All these weird things have been happening, and it's kind of like he has no real agency in that part of the story. He's just kind of waiting for something to happen, and then he finds out he's a wizard. And this whole adventure begins. The point of no return, or his Act 2 into Act 3, is the moment that he decides, they assume that it's Snape going after the Sorcerer's Stone, and they decide he can't get the stone because he's going to give it to Voldemort. We have to do something, even if we get in trouble. Okay? You can also think at a more recent story, The Hate You Give. The moment, not so much an adventure, but the moment that the parts of the story really go into motion for Star is when Khalil is shot. She's there, she witnesses it, she has now been brought into everything that happens afterwards, whether she wants to be or not. And the point of no return, or the Act 2 and Act 3 for that story, really takes place, and this was a little bit hard because there's so much going on in this story, but I feel like it takes place when you get the not guilty verdict. That they just, the jury decides that the officer is not responsible for shooting Khalil. That's when Star really makes a decision. She decides her voice has to be heard. Okay, so as you can see, you can use this for fantasy stories, for science fiction, but you can also use it for those realistic contemporary stories to kind of decide those big moments for your character. All right, so here's an exercise you can start with to kind of brainstorm some ideas for how to create tension and conflict in your story if you don't already have some written down. And what you want to do is consider the conflicts or hurdles that the character needs to face next. So you may be at very different places in your stories as you're writing. Some of you may still be at the beginning, depending on how long your story ends up being. Some of you may be in the middle or towards the end. But you want to consider how your story is meant to end. Hopefully you have a little bit of an idea, even if you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So you want to think about the things that need to happen for your character to get there, the struggles they have to face, the lessons they need to learn, all of that stuff goes into creating the tension and conflict. You also want to consider how your allies can trip up their own protagonist. So is anyone keeping secrets from your character that maybe you need to know, or maybe they think that you don't need to know, but it turns out, the whole secret's blown wide open and then everyone's upset. It affects what's going to happen in the rest of the story. You want to consider how the protagonist gets in their own way, because that's another way that kind of internal conflict we've got going on. So what mistakes does your character make either in action or in judgment that lead to consequences for both themselves, for their allies, for maybe people they don't know yet? And when we think about that definition that we talked about at the beginning of tension, what kind of balance or dynamic is holding all of your characters together? Why can't they walk away? Why are they working with each other? And if you upset that balance, what happens? And you do want to upset that balance to some degree. Okay. Another way, and I'm not going to go... I'm not going to get really far into it because I want to give you kind of a shorter video, but another great way that you can use to create tension and to reveal information about your characters and the story is dialogue. And so your Nano workbook talks about it on pages 38 to 41, and this image that I've got is actually from page 41 of the workbook. But these are some dramatic dialogue exercises that you can try to build that tension. But also to work on your speech in the story. So what your characters are saying to each other, because that's important too. You're going to do a lot of showing. You're going to have some exposition. You should hopefully have some action here and there. But you also want dialogue between your characters. That's an important component too. And if you look at these, you're going to see some of the words that we talked about. So you're looking at words like change, you're looking at choices, the conflicts between the characters and their relationships. So you can write a scene of dialogue that creates tension between your protagonist and one of their supporting characters. Or you can write a scene of dialogue where a supporting character tells your protagonist something that will change the course of their actions. Maybe that secret we were talking about on the last slide. You could reveal a plot twist, some different things to think about as you're moving through your story, and maybe later you come back and realize that there's a scene that you didn't know what to do, and this helps. Okay. But the next slide we've got is actually the writing prompts that I give you guys every week. So at the top here, this one is going to require you to kind of go back and think about the 3-act idea of a story. So if you haven't written the point of no return scene, which is your pivot from Act 2 into Act 3, when they decide that, they have to do something, regardless of what happens to them, what consequences may be. maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're still early in your story, but go ahead and take a stab at that scene. Go ahead and try writing out of order a little bit and consider what that might look like. And that might help you, if you're still early in your story, figure out exactly how you need to get there. Alternately, you could write a scene or an internal conflict that your characters kind of battled the entire story, explodes onto the scene. So remember we talked about that could be insecurities, doubts, character flaws, mental illness. But in this scene, they absolutely must face this problem right now. They can't sidestep it. They can't, deflect. No one's going to let them. They have to deal with it. So how will their choice in the scene affect the rest of the story and the characters? So you kind of, as you're writing that scene, think about those consequences that are going to spread out and affect the rest of your scenes. And as always, if you're on a roll, continue with your current scene, but just make sure that you're kind of raising the stakes and considering the 4C formula. So your change, choice, conflict, and those consequences. Okay. Got one last slide for you guys, and I don't have any books that you can check out from the library today, but if you want more tips on tension and a little bit of dialogue, these are two articles about building tension in your story, written by writers that you can look for. So How to Build Tension and Heighten the Stakes by Jessica Page Morell, which you can find on writersdigest.com. If you do a Google search with that title, you should find it, but you'll want to look for her name to make sure that it's her. And the same for How to Weave Threads of Tension Through Your Story by Krista Kiefer on wellstoried.com. And she actually has, if you look at her blog, she has a lot of materials that can help you with tons of different stuff. But if you go to the story elements section, she actually has several different blog posts about tension and conflict that could help you. This was the one that I thought had the meatiest amount and would really be useful to you guys, but she has tons of stuff. All right, so that's all I got for you this week. Hopefully that helps you think about your conflicts, create that tension for your characters that keeps them reading, but also to kind of give your characters agency through their choices and, making things happen. Next week, I will have some information for you about kind of wrapping up your story, going back and doing revisions after you're finished, and maybe thinking about getting involved with groups that support young writers, or thinking about next steps like publishing. If that's something you want to do, I'll give you some resources that will kind of guide you in your start there to think about whether you would do self-publishing or what it's like to, publish with a publishing house, working with an agent, different things like that. I'm so excited for where your stories are right now. Keep chugging along at that word count and adding stuff in, and remember to celebrate your successes. You are, halfway through this challenge, and I'll see you guys next week.